It's the biggest story of 2023 so far, the return of the legendary Jon Jones from a 3-year hiatus, this time as a heavyweight. With his debut matchup now set in stone for March 4th, UFC 285, and the masterful striker Ciryl Gane as his opponent, the question now is just how impressive this 205 legend will look when he finally moves up in weight. Here's what some of his fellow fighters have to say on the matter. Curtis Blaydes. One man who will have his eyesights fixed firmly on the UFC 285 main event is Curtis Blaydes, the longtime contender who could just never get past the massive power punches of the division. But with Derek Lewis showing signs of decline and his old rival Francis Ngannou now totally out of the picture, a powerful wrestler like Blaydes has all of a sudden become a very legitimate title threat. And when it comes to wrestling, there is no one better in the division than he is. Or at least that was the case before Jon Jones announced his intention to debut in the division. Curtis seems to think that the result of the fight will boil down to how willing Jones is to make his wrestling the primary weapon in his offense. If Jon decides to try and prove a point about his striking in there with someone like Gane, things could truly get dicey. But if Jones sticks to his strength and tries to put Cyryl's takedown defense to the test, that, according to Curtis Blaydes, is how he will find the win. Michael Bisping. Michael Bisping isn't the first to point this out, and he won't be the last. But we learned a lot about Ciryl Gane in that matchup against Francis Ngannou. In that fight, Francis, who is no All-American wrestler, was able to use his takedowns to dramatically alter the course of the fight for himself. By the time the 5th round was finished, it was the takedowns and his top control that stood as the major point winners in the eyes of the judges. And while there has been some time for Ciryl Gane to improve his bottom game and overall defensive wrestling, Bisping believes that Jon Jones is another level of wrestler entirely. A guy whose ability in that field goes far beyond someone like Francis Ngannou. The count sees Jones' experience and dynamic takedown threat being a major Achilles heel for the striking-heavy approach of Ciryl Gane. The Frenchman is no slouch on the ground, but there are levels to the wrestling at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu game, and for Bisping, Jon is simply leagues ahead. Belal Muhammad and Joe Rogan. We are hearing a lot about Ciryl Gane's defensive wrestling and Jon Jones' newly added body mass, but a conversation between Belal Muhammad and Joe Rogan on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast touched on the addition of Henry Cejudo to his corner, and how having a proven winner like Triple C in the gym every day could be a major boost. Belal rightly points out that finding the right training partners for a guy like Jon Jones could be difficult, especially when everyone knows exactly who he is and what getting the better of him would mean. Jones has always been known as a guy who is very picky about training partners, but with an opponent like Gane in front of him and his team, there is no doubt that they will be forced to bring in some fresh names. How that works out is anyone's guess, but it's an interesting point from the UFC welterweight contender. Henry Cejudo. Speaking of Henry Cejudo, the former 2-weight world champion and Olympic gold medalist may well be coming back to the octagon sooner than you think. And if the current rumor mill is anything to go by, he's in the process of gearing up for another stint in mixed martial arts as we speak. But for now, he certainly has his hands full with the returning Jon Jones, who linked up with him for his camp a few months ago. According to Henry, fighting Ciryl Gane may well spring up more problems for Jon than a fight with Ngannou ever would have. Speaking on his official channel, Cejudo explains just how much he appreciates Cyryl's bodywork, how he makes those early investments to the midsection with his striking. And when he heard that the fight with Francis was no longer on the table, he made a point of telling Jones that this Ciryl Gane guy was just about as legit as can be. And if Jones can't quite get the French former interim champion to the mat, there's a good chance that will be in a lot of trouble. Robert Whittaker. Robert Whittaker didn't leave anything to the imagination with his take on Jon Jones. As soon as he had the space to make his statement, he made it clear that he sees Jones as the single greatest fighter of all time, a guy who did it all in his division, beating the best of the best across multiple generations. And Bobby Knuckles thinks that an occasion like UFC 285's main event will produce the biggest pay-per-view numbers in a non-Conor McGregor fight that we have seen for quite some time. Safe to say, Robert Whittaker is a fan of this fight, and of the man who hopes to add heavyweight gold to his already insane trophy cabinet. Aljamain Sterling. You're going to begin to notice a trend here. Like most people, the UFC bantamweight champion Aljamain Sterling seems to think that Jones' best route to victory will come from his wrestling. During his finest years at 205 pounds, you could almost get the sense that Jon was choosing to try and beat some of his contenders at what they do best, just because he could. The Funkmaster believes that this could be a terrible idea in there with Ciryl Gane. And lest we forget, the Frenchman was making easy work on Francis Ngannou on the feet in between the parts of the fight he spent on his back. Jones is an amazing striker, but most of these fighters agree that Ciryl Gane is on another level. Tread carefully, Jon Jones. Chael Sonnen. Funnily enough, after hearing what Aljamain Sterling had to say, it seemed like the fighters we've heard from have reached a general consensus. Well, Chael Sonnen seems to think differently. In his mind, sure, you could say that Ciryl Gane is the better, more polished and more seasoned striker of the two, but the American gangster was quick to remind us of the fact that Jones always seems to fall back on his striking in his toughest fights, namely his narrow wins over Alexander Gustafsson and Dominic Reyes. And for Chael, who shared the cage with Bones all those years, he sees a heavyweight Jon Jones as a truly scary proposition on the feet, even for someone as technical as Ciryl Gane. Daniel Cormier. Daniel Cormier may have retired several years ago, but he still has several close ties to the UFC 285 main event. Obviously, his relationship with Jon Jones was just about as sour as can be, but now in his role as an analyst, he finds some interesting parallels between his own position a few years ago and the spot Jon Jones is in right now. Like DC, Jon has now moved up in weight and he's attempting to add heavyweight gold to his resume. And like Cormier's own position when Jones was suspended, DC made a point of warning Jon that he should develop thicker skin. In his eyes, even if Jones is successful, the fans will no doubt be quick to remind him that Francis Ngannou is still the best heavyweight in the world. Eerily similar to Cormier's own predicament at 205 pounds, don't you think? Cormier knows better than anyone that Jon Jones is one of the greatest fighters to ever do it. And if he had to place a bet on either man, we're sure his money would be on the guy who went 2-0 over him at the height of his powers. Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou dominated the headlines during the week of this fight's announcement. After a quick and incredibly violent spell in the top flight, the Predator has officially parted ways with the UFC, moving into free agency in an attempt to carve out a career that gives him the freedom to compete the way he wants to. But during his long and interesting interview with Ariel Helwani, the veteran reporter made a point of asking the now former champion if he would be tuning in for the UFC 285 main event. To his credit, Ngannou had no problem admitting that he would be watching the fight for his old title, although he doesn't agree that the fight is as undisputed as the UFC are claiming. As for his prediction, he thinks it will depend on which version of Jon Jones shows up. He believes that Jones' experience and his veteran savvy may be the key to victory against someone as inexperienced as Gane, but either way, he awaits the March 4th fight card with some real excitement. Ciryl Gane. And finally, we come to Jones' fellow UFC 285 headliner himself, Ciryl Gane. There's no shortage of respect coming from Gane and his team for the fighter who stands in front of them. But interestingly, when Ciryl was asked about the potential size difference between him and Jon and what type of role it might play in the fight, his answer was certainly a confident one. Jones, surprisingly enough, is actually pegged to be the bigger fighter between the two of them, with some estimates putting his walk-around weight at over 250 pounds. Gane, on the other hand, has come in at exactly 247 pounds for his last 2 weeks against Francis Ngannou and Tai Tuivasa. And in his mind, given the sheer size of the heavyweights he has faced in the past, he doesn't feel like it will be a factor. Ciryl is a natural heavyweight, a guy who has only competed amongst the biggest men in MMA, so for him, if anything, it'll be Jones who comes into this fight with a disadvantage. Only time will tell, I guess.